Good afternoon and welcome to the Debut Spotlight, a special Wednesday edition. My name is Ellen Comisar and I'm delighted today to introduce Blaze Nation to Charles B. Fancher, who is the author of a wonderful new book, Red Clay, which came out February 4th. So welcome, Charles.
Well, welcome. It's absolutely appreciated. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. So let me just do a little bit of Blaze housekeeping and then we'll dive right in. For those of you who are part of Blaze Nation, welcome back. We're always happy to see you. For those of you who are new to the Blaze and first-time viewers, let me tell you a little bit about us. We are a group of about 30 creative professionals who volunteer our time to bring authors to readers and books to readers and all of the above. We started in the age of COVID and are going strong and have no intention of going away. Our 5th anniversary is coming up next month, which is really hard to believe. You can find us all over social media, Twitter, which we don't call X, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. We are, of course, on the web at amightyblaze.com. And if you go to that lovely site, you can sign up for our newsletter and you will find out all about our upcoming events and back events. And of course, all of our programming lives forever on Facebook and YouTube, so you can always go back and find our great interviews. So I'm delighted to talk about Red Clay, which I read a few months ago and just have been waiting eagerly for this interview. I am not alone in loving this book. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution called it an evocative historical family saga. Bookclub.com says it's compelling. Publishers Weekly says Fancher imbues the narrative with a rich humanity. There's plenty for historical fiction fans to admire. Others have praised the book as amazing, fascinating, gripping, heartbreaking, riveting, nuanced, and deeply personal and universal at the same time. And the praise that I found most compelling, and I really think everyone should pay attention to, is that of Linda Winslow, who's a former executive producer for the PBS NewsHour, who said that Red Clay belongs in every school library. So can't agree more than that. And Charles, I'll just have a little more to go on. I'm going to read you your bio, so sit back and relax. Charles B. Fancher is a writer and editor and a former senior corporate communications executive for the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. He also worked as a journalist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Detroit Free Press, and the NBC affiliate in Nashville, Tennessee. And he's worked as a publicist for ABC TV network. He has been a lecturer at Howard University and an adjunct professor at Temple. He lives in Pennsylvania's Pocono Mountains, and there's plenty more to read about him in his bio, which I found fascinating, at his website, which is charlesbfancher.com. So, Charles, let's talk about Red Clay.
Well, I thank you again for having me. This is just a lovely experience, and I'm looking forward to being able to tell everybody about this book, which in many ways is a real labor of love, because
it's a beautiful one.
Thank you.
Look at that cover. Your name in big print, finally.
That's great. It was special because it's based on a lot of family anecdotes. My great-grandfather, whose name was Felix, was a little boy of about 8 years old at the time of emancipation on a plantation in southern Alabama. And he was a remarkable figure in that he was able to overcome enormous adversity to build a life for himself and for his family through the really exhilarating years of Reconstruction, but even through the tougher years that followed in Jim Crow. This is a book that tries to understand what was happening on both sides of that racial fence, because the end of the Civil War represented a time when both Black people and white people were having to adjust to an entirely new order. The worlds in which both of them lived had turned upside down. And being able to navigate through all of that from their different points of view was a very difficult thing. And that's at the heart of the story of Red Clay.
Ellen,
I'm sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Are you?
No, I was going to say, it begins when at Felix's funeral in 1943. He's in his 80s. And at his funeral, an elderly white woman shows up who later meets his family and walks up to his granddaughter and says, "A lifetime ago, my family owned yours." And that is the beginning of a conversation through which the story of Felix and how his family and her family made their way through that most difficult period in American history.
It's really interesting because it is a very balanced telling. I mean, you think of Felix as sort of the main protagonist, but you have his parents, you have the plantation owners, and this woman who shows up late in life who Felix knew as a child. But you also have very rich portrayals of the white owners, the slave owners at the time, and what their interior conversations were and what they were thinking about their position in society and how it changed. So it was very much, there was a balancing in a way that I imagine was, took some effort to make sure that you were not putting your finger on the scale, so to speak, and really giving both sides sort of even play.
Well, I'm glad you picked up on that. And while I might differ with you on the notion that I was trying to be balanced, I think my goal was really to provide insight into how events affected people on each side of that fence in very different ways. Human beings are very complex creatures. They're neither all bad nor all good. They have passions. They have sets of experiences that make each one of them unique. And how unique individuals respond to the conditions in which they find themselves is a remarkable story. It is what makes us human. And it's our entry point into understanding history and the time and the place in which it occurs on a much deeper level than if we try to create, on the one hand, balanced creatures, right, and on the other hand, simply cardboard cutouts that are, stereotypes of what we think they ought to be. We're far too complex as human beings to be able to do it that way.
And I think that all comes across really well in the book. There are characters who at times you're like, okay, he's a pretty good guy. He's not so bad. And then later you're like, wait a minute, what's going on? So I know you talk about this being your great-grandfather's stories. Can you talk a little bit? I know you began thinking this was going to be a book of creative nonfiction or narrative nonfiction, and obviously it has morphed into a beautiful fiction creation. It's lovely. How did you decide to switch it? What was working on the nonfiction or that you moved over, or not working in the nonfiction that you felt it's time to switch it and get creative?
Well, my mother, who was well into her 90s when we started having this conversation, started telling me these stories that I had never heard before about her grandfather, in whose house she had been raised, because her father died young. And she and her brother and her mother came to live with Felix. But I had never heard some of these little snippets about his life that she was telling me. And, I think it surprised her too, because, at one point in that conversation, she said, you should write a book. He would be a great character. And
Thanks, Mom.
I let that marinate for a long time before I did anything about it. But I had a point where I had an opportunity to go down to South Alabama, where I was born, where Felix had lived all of his life. And in fact, his daughter, my grandmother, still lived in that house that he had built with his own hands. And I remembered that house. And I went down and spent a lot of time just walking around and talking to people, and then did the more journalistically proper thing. I started doing real hard research. I started going into archives and the old records at the courthouse and all of that. And I was finding interesting information, but as is often the case when you try to research Black families, you hit stone walls. And some of them I realized were going to be insurmountable. But fortunately for me, at the same time, I realized something else. And that was that as I had been doing this work, a vision of Felix, who I had never met, he died 6 years before I was born. I had never met him, but a vision of him had started to take root in my mind. And I had this compelling picture of a man in full. I didn't have to create it along the way. He just suddenly, there he was. And I realized I can tell a better story, and a story that in many ways is more true, not just about him, but about the era in which he lived, about the obstacles that he had to overcome, the joys, the sadnesses, all of those things that make for a rich human experience were right there and could better be told as a novel than as a piece of narrative nonfiction. So I went back to my mother and I said, you know what? I can't do it. I'm going to try to do a novel. And I thought she was going to be upset by that. She was a librarian, and steeped in research and all of that. And she said, okay. So I was off to the races at that point.
Was it scary or freeing to break out of the strictures of nonfiction and let your mind go, in the sense of creating these characters? If Felix came to you as a full-grown character and you knew exactly who he was, there were lots of ancillary characters, some of which I know are pegged to real life people, and then I'm sure there are many that are completely fictive. So what were the challenges of, as a journalist, you're kind of used to sticking to the facts. How did it free you up? Was it scary? Was it something you weren't used to?
It freed me up. I was able to move much more easily. Once that decision was made, that was the key, making the decision that it was not going to be nonfiction, that this was going to be a creative work. I felt very free after that. And as long as I had a core story to tell, I could wrap in all the other elements as I needed them. And I found that to be enormously satisfying.
Did you find yourself diverging a lot from the original narrative you thought you would tell? Are there like side trips you took in the novel that, not necessarily strictly align with the stories you had heard and the anecdotes?
Well, in some cases, yes. But the thing that really made the difference, that really set me on the path, was the moment at which I made the decision to have the daughter of the plantation owner, Addie, as she's called, come face to face with Felix's granddaughter, old white woman, very young black woman, meeting for the first time. They share a family name, but
Right.
neither of them really knows the whole story of the one person that they both have in common. And once that device presented itself to me, to put these two together, to discover what each of them knew about this guy and about the times in which he had lived and stories that he had been told, because neither of them knew the whole story. But it was only after they were talking face to face that the story began to emerge. So we dropped back from 1943 to the late 1800s, and then we have our story. Once that happened, once I knew that, then I had a platform on which I could build.
One of the things I loved about the book is that the geography of Red Clay, Alabama, which is a fictionalized small town where there were plantations, that it comes alive in the sense of the nature and the rivers and the birds and the smells. You say you went back to Alabama. Did you purposely pay attention to all of that while you were there? Was that something you had remembered from times when you had visited as a child?
It was both things. I lived there long enough as a child to have some pretty clear memories of what the place looked like and the surrounding area of the real town. But then when I went back as an adult with the intent of researching a book, then I was able to look at it again and absorb details, very specific things, what things smelled like, and what people did and what their relationships were, how they spoke, and
what
all of that became clear, and what they ate. A lot of which I remember eating myself, at my grandma's kitchen table.
Sure. I mean, I think it's interesting sort of from a thematic standpoint is that obviously the land to an enslaved person was the location of so much torture, so much hard labor, so many indignities. And at the same time, the slaves and then the freedmen are sort of inspired by the land and aware of the nature and aware of all the beauty it holds. And there's this great dichotomy of it being both, just like the people are both, good and evil. The land sort of has that same characteristic.
Well, it does. It's very fertile. That there's not an accident that there were plantations there, because the ground is fertile and it gives life to plants and to animals. Its habitat is remarkable, but there are also great areas of it that are barren, and that's the red clay. There was across the road from my grandma's house, the one that Felix built, there was a big open hill it was bare. It was just red clay that would stain your clothes. And that's where I played when I stayed with her. And it's a unique shade of red. It has a unique feel when you pick it up and move it around between your fingers. And symbolically, it represents many things. It is certainly the red color, the clay literally, but that is soil that is also red from blood that was shed. And I just couldn't think of any better name for the novel than Red Clay, because it's at the heart of everything.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about Charles Fancher's debut novel, Red Clay, set in Alabama in 3 different time periods that we sort of bounce back and forth, learning both about Felix's days as a young boy and as a slave, his early life and as an emancipated man and family man. And then ultimately we learn in retrospect what his life was like at the end of his life. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is secrets, because secrets play a big part. And I was curious that you said that it was not until your mother was in her 90s that she started telling these stories. And I'm wondering if you had some sense of why that was. What was it about your mother's nature or your family's life that sort of kept her from telling those stories earlier and holding them back?
Well, I don't know if she hadn't told them to me before because she just didn't.
Right.
Or if she had made mention of them and I just wasn't paying attention. It's entirely possible that she had told me some of those things and they just hadn't registered in the way that they did in that particular conversation. And I guess, I was just ready for it.
Right.
And was able to absorb it.
Mm-hmm. And we have secrets then also within the characters. There's a lot of power of Felix gets told secrets. People share the fact that they are aware of the secret or trade secrets as a means of sort of keeping somebody else in line. I'm going to trust you with my secret, but watch out, I might release it at the right time and all hell will break loose. So I found that really an interesting sort of theme, that all these different characters who had very different reasons for keeping secrets did so throughout. So,
well, secrets have a lot of power, and they can be power to protect, but they can also be power to inflict pain. And sometimes the two become confused. You're not really sure if by keeping a secret, you're doing the best thing
right.
for all involved, or whether by revealing it, outing some truth that you're either helping or hurting, but they have power. And that to me was a very important dynamic to explore, because it enabled characters to circle each other.
Yes.
Sometimes not knowing what the other one really knew.
And it gave people who were powerless all of a sudden had something on the more powerful, and they were able to, change roles a little bit, which as you spoke about, at the end of the war and emancipation, everybody's role changed. It wasn't just that slaves were now free. It was that plantation owners and slaveholders no longer had laborers and people they owned, and their whole standing, relatively speaking, in the community changed as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, obviously there's a lot of nonfiction and history books written about these time periods, as well as many great books of fiction. I have been saying this is the new Roots for our generation, that, I grew up reading Roots, watching the TV series, being enlightened about many aspects of American history that had been portrayed in at least my social studies books in a very I don't know, sort of a calm way. And Roots came out, and there was a real visceral feeling of who these people were, and not just this homogenous slave community. I'm wondering, did you do a lot of reading of other fictions or other history books as part of your creative process, or did you steer away from them purposefully?
Well, I found myself from time to time, just for historical um, context, to looking at Eric Foner's book about Reconstruction. I found that one just, for factual purposes,
Right.
among many others. Um, but I think just running through my head, there were books that I had read over the years that dealt with different aspects of it, fiction as well as nonfiction, and a lot of more contemporary work.
Such as?
Well, one of them is not one that you would expect, and it's the novels of James Lee Burke. He is a crime writer who's, for my money, is probably mischaracterized as a crime novelist. I think his work borders on the literary.
Interesting.
And he has a character through 20 some odd novels named Dave Robichaux, who is an alcoholic Louisiana cop who struggles with his demons. But he's very smart and very insightful, and he often ruminates about the human condition, and particularly in the context of Black and white relations in the Deep South, embedded in history. And I often found myself thinking about that and the way that Burke looks at it. Although I was dealing with a completely different story in a completely different time frame. I think there was something about that, this understanding how people behaved on different sides of the fence that runs through the same property.
Lovely metaphor.
There was that. And then, of course, Toni Morrison, James Gaines, and others. Name just flew out of my head. The author who wrote the Easy Rawlins books.
Oh, I'm blanking too.
We both know who we're talking.
Yes,
Walter Mosley.
There we go.
Sorry, I don't know why that flew. But there are just so many influences, all of which flitted in and out of my brain as I was working.
Which is why writers are always good readers, because you never know what genre, what author, what century will inspire you as you're writing whatever it is you're writing. Tell us a little bit, if you will, about how the publishing process was for you. If you're a journalist, as you were, you're sort of used to that daily grind, and maybe you're working on a project that takes a few months if it's a big investigative piece. But oftentimes it's, in, out, done, on to the next. I know you started working on this in 2020. Can you just talk a little bit about how the process unfolded for you, how you got an agent, what your experience has been like dealing with other editors when you've been used to being an editor?
Well, when once I had a draft, I wasn't quite sure of what to do with it. And, purely by chance, I stumbled across the application for a a literary contest, and submitted it as in the novel in progress category. And it was named a finalist in that one. So it was very encouraging. I thought, well, maybe I can do something with this. And I began submitting it to agents. I followed the usual advice. Look at what these agents are looking for, look at the work that they've represented, and structure queries that play to that. I played by all of the rules, and I got pretty creative responses. I'm actually, in retrospect, kind of proud of that. I didn't get many of the thank you but no thank you responses. I actually got some that were quite thoughtful, and that was very helpful. But one of the things that I figured out was that I needed a good editor, and I had some recommendations from friends, and I ended up connecting with an editor who gave me some very good advice.
So a developmental editor more than...
Yeah. And so I finally had a draft that I thought was pretty good. And I then started submitting to agents again. And, I was still not hitting the mark. And I finally decided, I'm just going to self-publish. There was a lot of talk at the time about, the new hybrid model.
Sure.
And I figured I would just try that, because one of the submissions I had made had been actually disheartening. It was the only one. There were several who had asked for complete manuscripts, which is usually a good sign.
Yes.
But in the end had passed. And this particular one was really especially enthusiastic. And I'd heard back from her 3 days after I submitted, which was like some kind of world record. And then nothing. Crushed, just dead. And I thought, wow, something's not right here. And that was when I started thinking about the hybrid thing in self-publishing. And I was within inches of doing it. I had run it through another editor. I had hired a designer to come up with the cover, the whole thing. And the phone rang, and it was Chip Rice from WordLink Literary Agency. And he said, "You're probably surprised to hear from us, but the agent on our team who originally read it just ran into some issues and was not able to pursue it, and shared it with some of the rest of us. And I read it, and I love it, and I want to represent you."
Perfect.
And not long after that, Chip was able to make the sale to Blackstone Publishing.
And this is the beautiful book that came out. This is Red Clay with a gorgeous cover, debut novel that arrived February 4th, just in time for Black History Month, and is an important book to add to the canon of literature for Black History Month. It tells a marvelous story, and it also, and I think this is your writer's flair, there are so many beautiful scenes and beautiful sentences. And when I'm looking for a book, it can tell the most engaging story, but if the sentences land with a thud, I'm like, I'm out of here. And people who have watched my show over the year, they know that if I'm talking it up, it's a beautifully written book. And I really applaud you for that. So we're going to see what kind of questions we have for Charles Fancher. And if our producer can put some up for us, that would be great. Do you have any more books in you, Charles? As a big fan of ours, Renee Hershkowitz.
Yeah, I do actually.
What's in the works?
I'm going to be cagey and coy on this. I'm not going to talk about them, but there is a manuscript that's marinating in the drawer that a few people have seen and think it's got some potential. So it's just about ready to put it out there and see if anyone bites.
Okay.
And a few other pieces as well. But the short answer to the question is, yeah, I think there's a second and maybe even a third book.
Oh, wow.
It's starting to percolate in my head.
And are these characters that we've gotten to know and love or know and hate, are they going to show up again? Or don't you want to say?
Actually, a couple of them might.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Because I would imagine these characters, having spent 4 years with them at least, and more in your mother's telling of the stories, are very central to your thinking. And are they still in your head?
Oh, they're still there. When I was writing the final pages, I was starting to dream about them, which was both scary and enjoyable.
All right. Other questions? Love that Miles Davis poster behind you, Charles. Does music play a role in this book?
There are a couple of musical moments here and there, but not especially. Yeah, Miles is a real favorite of mine. Do
you listen to music when you write?
I do, and of various types. I listen to a lot of jazz when I'm working, but sometimes I default to singer-songwriter stuff as well, and occasionally classical. I listen to a lot of jazz.
I would think it might be hard to listen to vocals while you're trying to think of words.
Well, it depends on what I'm working on. There are some singers whose work I know pretty well, and I'm not really listening to their lyrics so much anymore because I know them. It's more the sound of their voice and the accompaniment that strikes some synaptical chord in my brain.
Mm-hmm. Are there? What are you reading these days? Do you have time to read?
Well, yeah, occasionally. I just finished James, by Percival Everett, which I thought was just a lot of fun. And I finished recently what I think is the last in the series, the James Lee Burke series about the detective in Louisiana called Cleet. It's Cleet Purcell, his Robichaux's buddy. And I listened as a book on tape, or boy, that betrays how old I am, isn't it?
Digital. I still call them that.
An audio book. I think I'm maybe the last person in the world to finally get around to listening to it. But Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by McBride. So those are, I think, the last three things I've.
Yeah, I had trouble with that audio, but I know your book is out in audio, and I've seen that you've interviewed and had a conversation with your narrator. Did you have any say in picking a narrator? And
yeah, some. They Blackstone was wonderful on that. They asked me, what's the voice like in your head? What do you, what do these people sound like to you? And we had a real conversation about that. And then they came back to me with Dion Graham, who I have since learned is a real superstar in the audiobook world. And he and I had conversations about characters, how I thought they sounded and so on. So I was delighted with the process.
Well, you can buy Charles's book at bookshop.org. It's on our bookshelf. You can also go to libro.fm, which is our preferred place to buy audiobooks. It's a beautiful book, red clay, and it has been great to talk to you, Charles. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, I have enjoyed it as well.
Thank you. We will be back next month, March 27th, back to Thursdays with Julia R. Kelly, who has written The Fisherman's Gift. And it's a very different book. It's set in a wintry Scottish village in 1900 when a young boy mysteriously washes up on shore and sets off a storm of secrets. It's a beautiful book also. And so I look forward to seeing Blaze Nation back here on March 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Till then, keep reading.